I have the pleasure of introducing one of the legends of broadcasting. He started off as a reporter from the Midwest. He became, he's a journalist. He has run CBS Sports. He has run CBS News. He's run Fox News. And he's married to the wonderful Kathleen Brown, our former state treasurer. He is a dear friend of mine, and I want you to give him a warm welcome, Van Gordon Sauter.
A couple of months ago, Jamie asked me to introduce Geoffrey Cowan. And I just blatantly lied. Mendacity. I said, of course I'll introduce Geoffrey Cowan. Hello? Better? Okay, that's me. We should have Marvin up here, who's been in front of these so many for so long. And I lied because you can't introduce Geoffrey Cowan. There are so many Geoffrey Cowans out there operating in the identity of Geoffrey Cowan. Fortunately, they're all beneficial, they're all busy, and they're all contributing to the common good. Leadership and civil rights, writing and scholarship, management and enhancement of premier academic programs at USC and UCLA, restoring the voice of America, and most recently, envisioning and administrating the transformation of the Sunnylands estate into a brilliant international meeting center, which began its endeavors with a meeting between the president and his counterpart from China. Jeff is so exhausting as a professional, all I can do is direct you to Wikipedia. And I want to introduce him as a friend. A couple years ago, he called out of the blue and said to me, "How about dinner with Bud Schulberg?" Well, I was chairman, and now I'm just a member, of the California Boxing Commission, and Schulberg was a premier American fight fan. Not to mention that he wrote On the Waterfront, Facing the Crowd, The Harder They Fall. It was for me a memorable evening sitting with Bud Schulberg and talking about the fights. But Schulberg was a gift that Jeff Cowan gave to me. And at his core, that's what Jeff is. He's into gifting readers, students, universities, listeners in woe-begone countries trying to find the truth about what's going on in the world, and a gift to international leaders and organizations who are seeking a comfortable and private place to discuss the issues of a complex, truculent world. In summary, Jeff's an incredibly valuable citizen. To me, he's just a hell of a good guy. So join me in welcoming him to the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival.
The rest of you came here perhaps to hear my talk, but I want to hear more from Van. Van, could you keep on going for a while? That was really great. Some of you probably know that I wrote a book 25 years ago about Clarence Darrow, and got a lot of attention at the time. It was an exciting thing to do. So I thought maybe every quarter century I'd write a book. I wanted to get this one out in time to get an introduction from Van, in time to, as well, I was still part of Sunnylands, to be part of Jamie's amazing festival. And also hoping that I'd be able to have a book on this subject, and I'll talk later about why I wrote this particular book, but a book about this subject that would come out in time for this year, but who could have imagined what a year this would be? It's a little awkward to talk about, or maybe I should say intimidating, to talk about the birth of the presidential primary and to talk about what primaries are in a room filled with so many people who themselves have lived through that and have been such an important part of it. Of course, we have in the room Ray Davis, we have in the room Barbara Boxer, we have in the room Mickey Cantor, and many other, Kathleen Brown was mentioned before, an incredible room full of people who have been involved in politics. And as you'll see as we talk about this today, the story of 1912 is both an amazing story about a remarkable man, but a story with incredible resonance for today. Roosevelt's role in 1912 is best known for his creation of the Bull Moose Party, and that's how people often identify it. We'll come to a little bit of that. But I would say that his most important role in 1912 was in creating something that we take for granted, which is the presidential primary. And so the story of his creation of a presidential primary in 1912 is really the story of this book, and it's a story of how he tried to reclaim the Republican nomination. If both parties selected nominees today the way they did before 1912, I think that the nominee of the Republican Party would be Jeb Bush. And on the Democratic Party, it's unlikely that Bernie Sanders would be a serious contender. That's how much things have changed because of this. And nobody would be talking seriously about Donald Trump. But as a result of the reforms of 1912, which we're going to discuss, and to some extent reforms that I was associated with in 1968, which we'll come back to a little bit later, there's an entirely different political landscape. So I want to give you some background. Roosevelt had been the president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt had, from 1901 until 1909. But when he won election, he became president when William McKinley was assassinated. He was the vice president. It was in the beginning of McKinley's term. And so he served almost an entire 8-year term as president. So he decided at the time that he was elected in 1904 that he would not seek a third term, a decision he later regretted very deeply. And he decided that he would find as his handpicked successor a man who he thought was the most lovable man he knew, a man he had once said was the one person who would make a great Chief Justice of the United States and also a great president, a man who was his great friend, William Howard Taft. So he really personally puts Taft into that role. And the book talks about how he does that. And Roosevelt then, in a very gracious move of a certain kind that was totally characteristic of him as a person, goes off to Africa for a year on a game hunting trip, and then comes back through Europe, and a trip in which he sees heads of state and represents the president at a funeral in England. An amazing moment in his life. He comes back to the United States, and people are starting to implore him and ask him to take on Taft because they think Taft isn't the man that he was. But he resists it for some time. And there's some reasons why he's against running for president at that point. But he also feels like that he will become president. He has a chance of becoming president in 1916. He has no need to run himself. So he resists all of those siren calls to run for president. But something else was happening at the same time that he couldn't entirely anticipate. First of all, he begins to find himself lonely, isolated, unimportant. This man who you all think of, from all you read about him before, as maybe one of the most vigorous and active and center of the action people in the United States, a person who Henry Adams once called all act, pure act, began to feel isolated and alone, living in his 22-room home in Oyster Bay. Maybe some of you have visited that home. Desolate place in the winter. And he begins to feel that he has irrelevant. And so these siren calls as they come to him begin to make him feel like, yes, I'd like to get back into the action. I want to be back as President of the United States. But at the time he assumes that the way in which he can become President of the United States is by getting his friends, the former party leaders, the current party leaders around the country, to turn to him. Because in his lifetime, every presidential nomination had been made by presidential conventions, by political conventions. And the people at those conventions are the men, and they were all men, that he knew and had worked with, and many of them loved him. So he thinks, I'm going to get them to support me. At the same time, there's a movement for popular democracy going on in the country. A movement to have primaries created. Roosevelt basically resists that movement. In fact, he in many dialogues talks about why popular democracy is not such a good idea. But at the same time that he's hoping that he'll have a chance to become the nominee himself, drafted by the leaders of the party, there's also a challenger on the left, somebody he doesn't anticipate. Robert La Follette of Wisconsin decides he wants to become the president. And La Follette actually, with friends of his and colleagues of his, begins to start a movement to create presidential primaries, a new concept as part of the progressive era. So 6 primaries are actually created by the fall of 1911. And as those primaries are created, it begins to seem possible that La Follette will become the beneficiary of them. So when Roosevelt realizes La Follette has a chance of actually taking this on, he decides that he has to become a candidate himself. And so I would say that when he becomes, at first I should say, he tries to stop La Follette from creating primaries. So just to give you one sense of it, and many of you know this, but many of you probably don't, the control of parties is actually, they're like a private club. They're like the National Football League. The decisions are not made, for the most part, by the government. So when the Republican National Committee or the Democratic National Committee meets, it sets the rules that guide the party. Well, when the Republican National Committee met in December of 1911, La Follette and his supporters are trying to get primaries everywhere. Taft is opposed to the primaries, but so is Roosevelt. And Roosevelt and all of his allies in December of 1911 are trying to block the idea of primaries. By mid-June of 1912, mid-January, Roosevelt concludes that he cannot get the nomination the old-fashioned way. He can't get the party bosses to go his way. They're too controlled by the President of the United States. They all have too many forms of patronage, too many forms of things that they need from the president. So Taft is going to control the convention unless it's possible to create primaries. So when Roosevelt decides to become president, announces for the presidency in January of 1912, he makes popular democracy the core of his campaign. Interestingly, he's fighting both Taft, but now he's also fighting La Follette. And in that calculus, he's afraid he's not going to get the progressive supporters on his side. So in fighting La Follette, he decides to become much more progressive as a candidate and endorses some policies that he would never have been against that alienate his moderate supporters in order to get all of the La Follette supporters in his camp. But anyway, once he decides that he has a chance of winning and begins to go into the campaign, he embraces popular democracy as his theme, and he gives a speech in Carnegie Hall in which he says the following: "The great fundamental issue now before the Republican Party and before our people can be stated briefly. Are the people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe that they are. My opponents do not. I believe in the right of the people to rule." That becomes his theme. And in fact, he shortens that theme to the pithy phrase, "Let the people rule." And it's the phrase that's on the button that I'm wearing, which is actually a perfect duplicate of the buttons of the era, and we have them available for you later. he becomes the champion of popular democracy, and people love it. But despite his enormous popularity, he loses the first presidential primary in history, which takes place on March 19th, 1912, where he's beaten by Robert La Follette in North Dakota. Roosevelt thought of himself as kind of a North Dakotan. After all, the rest of the world knew all of the stories about him as in the Badlands and as kind of a cowboy. But the North Dakota was a progressive state, and La Follette was a neighbor, and they went for La Follette. It was also clear that La Follette was going to win the third primary, which was going to be in Wisconsin on April 2nd. So Roosevelt has to win the second primary, which is going to take place in New York State on March 26th. After all, it's his home state. He'd been governor. He'd been president of the United States. This is a state he should win. So on March 25th, on the eve of the New York primary, Roosevelt speaks at 6 meetings in the city, 6 huge meetings, the biggest crowd of the night. Of course, it doesn't sound so big today compared to the kind of crowds that Trump and Sanders are getting, but it was big then. More than 3,000 people greeted him at the New Star Casino. And after warming up the audience, Roosevelt does what he did everywhere. He said at all of the other 5 stops that night, and it's always the same thing. He says, "I saw a letter from the president today expressing his pleasure that the people should be allowed to vote." The press talks about the fact that he uses that falsetto voice. They should be allowed to vote. Every time it draws laughter from the crowd. "It's not enough that you're allowed to vote," he says to the audience to great applause. "It's your right to vote." But this time, as the laughter subsided, a young woman at the back of that casino stands up, hurls her fist in the air and says, "Mr. Roosevelt, what about women? Shouldn't they be allowed to vote?" The press all talks about the fact that she has copied his falsetto voice perfectly. And by the time the crazy motion in the room this crazy woman in the back of the room, by the way, she's this 26-year-old petite Irish suffragist named Maud Malone. Roosevelt doesn't know who she is. This crazy commotion as goes on, and then she continues to shout. She says, "Mr. Roosevelt, you want women to have babies, but not the right to vote." The platform party was in total disarray. Roosevelt supporters all around the room asked her to take her seat. And with a bit of what you've all seen in movies when you're trying to calm down the audience, maybe we saw this in Casablanca, the orchestra starts to play. And the orchestra starts to play a new song of the era, just written by Irving Berlin, which may have a touch of irony in it, called "Take a Little Tip from Father." Several months later, after the primaries were over, Roosevelt decided that he was in favor of women's suffrage. But at this time in the campaign, during the primary part of the campaign, women were not among the people that Roosevelt said had a right to rule. At the time that he started his campaign, Roosevelt assumed that he could do it basically from New York, give a few speeches. He didn't have to want to campaign around the country. Part of what he was feeling back in Oyster Bay was he was feeling rheumatic. He was feeling weak. He felt like he was old, though he was only 53 years old. But now he knows he has to go out campaigning. This is the first time people are campaigning in a presidential primary. So late on the afternoon of March 26, before the New York State returns were in, Roosevelt boards the Chicago Limited for Chicago, headed for the Middle West, and by the way, we have quite a few Chicagoans in the room here, for his first campaign appearance outside of New York. After midnight, while he was sleeping, the news reports reached the train. The New York campaign had been a rout. Taft had beaten him in his own state by almost 2-1. And the same night, in a hotly disputed and probably somewhat corrupt series of caucuses, Taft had beaten Roosevelt in Indiana as well. The front page headlines were devastating. Here's what the New York Evening Post had to say. "The events of last week reduced Mr. Roosevelt's candidacy to the absurd, it said. It can no longer be pretended that he has a ghost of a chance to get a majority at the convention. The plain fact is that little is left of his campaign but anger, wrath, and malice. Out west, Hiram Johnson, many of us know and appreciate and certainly benefit from Hiram Johnson's role as one of Gray Davis's predecessors, governor of California. He was the reform governor just elected a year earlier. He was worried. However the results of New York and Indiana are obtained, he wrote to one of Roosevelt's close supporters, the ordinary individual looks only at the fact that Taft apparently has been victorious. But then came Illinois. Thanks to a clever and audacious campaign by Roosevelt's supporters, and particularly by the Chicago Tribune, which did things that I think today would be considered a combination of unethical and illegal. In late March, Illinois agreed to hold a primary on April 9th. The Chicago Tribune paid for his campaign in the state. They arranged all the logistics. The newspaper itself took on his campaign, not just on its editorial pages, but very cleverly editorially, and they hid it all. So none of this was known. Actually, it had been known until this book. Anyway, huge crowds greeted Roosevelt when Roosevelt's train, when it pulled into Chicago's Union Station at 2 p.m. on March 27th. Thousands of people lined the sidewalks from the station to Congress Hotel, cheering him on, calling Roosevelt's name as he passed. And that night, he addressed the largest political meeting ever held in America's second largest city. And a crowd of over 4,000 people filled the auditorium theater, while another 10,000 people stood outside the hall. Roosevelt was furious about what happened in New York, and he began to turn it into his own campaign theme, talking about the thievery and dishonesty of Taft and his supporters. He said that Taft had won the election through fraud and trickery, and he called it not just a farce, but a criminal farce. On his way back to Union Station that night, crowds along the route said, "Teddy, hurrah for Teddy." They shouted at him. It had been an exhilarating day, and he had found his voice. He had regained his energy, and he had learned that he had an enormous national audience for his message, his often angry message, his defiantly anti-establishment message of reform. Despite widespread predictions to the contrary, Roosevelt won Illinois in a rout. It was the first primary campaign in history to change a campaign's direction, to change its, what we now call, momentum. And after that, he began crisscrossing the state, practically living on trains, blasting Taft in speech after speech, in a campaign that people called a war to the knife. And he won almost everywhere. Of the remaining 10 primaries, he won 9. By the time the Republican convention opened in June, Roosevelt had won 9 of 13 newly created primaries, had earned 70% of the delegates who were popularly elected, and his supporters felt that he had a moral right and should have a legal right to the nomination. But Taft seemed almost certain to win because there were still more of the delegates who were picked the old-fashioned way, through those caucuses and conventions and party and boss control. And there was a reason why those bosses were with Taft, and a reason that echoes in today's newspapers, and that is that even though they thought Taft would lose the election, the party leaders wanted to retain control of the Republican Party. So they were willing to take the risk on a less popular candidate in order to retain control of the party. Anyway, as the convention opened, Roosevelt needed about 50 delegates at the National Convention, and many of you have been to national conventions. He needed about 50 of those delegates to change sides in order to win. His hopes seemed to lie in a series of credentials challenges. Challenges to the often corrupt process by which Taft and his supporters had gotten their nominations. And those challenges became the focus of almost all the attention at the time, and they're the focus of other histories of this period. But in fact, Taft thought he had another path to victory. What makes researching and writing history so much fun for me, and my guess is for Andrew and others who do it, is the chance to, in fact, Andrew, we're talking, what's the most fun part of it? Is it the research, is it the writing, is it talking about it, and it's the research. And to me, it's a kind of time travel. You go back to another era where you're touching and reading documents that maybe no person has read since the individual exchange. And you're reading fascinating material by interesting people. So I want you to join me on the morning of Friday, June 14th, in Roosevelt's 22-room home in Oyster Bay, Long Island, that estate that he called Sagamore Hill. The Taft-controlled Republican National Committee has started to meet in Chicago, and they're rejecting one TR challenge after another. Why? Because the insiders control the decision about those challenges. After each decision, Roosevelt supporters, including the rowdy group of reformers from California led by Herman Johnson, accused Taft and his managers of outright theft. On Roosevelt's desk that morning was a private typed letter from Brooks Adams, the great-grandson of one president, the grandson of another, and the brother of historian Henry Adams. The letter offers a striking warning. Here's what it says. It's your clear duty to go to Chicago and lead your own fight. This is a revolution, and revolutionists must succeed at their peril. You must win. You can take no chances. You know better than I what their organization is capable of. It has no scruples. It's not the bosses you're fighting, but the special interests who retain the bosses. All those special interests are now balanced against you at Chicago, and they are capable of anything, including murder. Including murder. If you give them the chance that Caesar gave to Brutus, therefore, lead your men yourself, trust no lieutenant. That's the kind of letter that makes historical research so fascinating. Here's a letter from one classically trained Harvard historian to another, from the scion of two presidents to a man who's served in the White House for 8 years himself, who says that the special interests who control the government are capable of anything, including murder. After reading the letter, Roosevelt called his floor manager in Chicago using the still relatively new device of the telephone. But he was convinced that his phones were being tapped. He agreed with Adams. He had to break precedent and go to Chicago and command his own troops. So at breakfast that Friday morning, he cheerfully told his family, and by the way, he was nothing at this point if not cheerful, that they were headed west. At 5:30 that afternoon, Roosevelt and his merry group of friends and family boarded the Lakeshore Limited, headed to Chicago. Reporters noted that he was wearing a new large black felt fedora hat with an extra wide brim. It resembled the hat that he had worn while commanding his troops in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, the group that he famously labeled the Rough Riders. That hat, that Rough Rider hat, had become the symbol of the campaign. You can see it on this campaign button, which also uses the words, "Let the people rule." The Lakeshore Limited pulled into Chicago's Grand Central Station at 4 p.m. on Saturday afternoon, June 15th. The weather was hot and sticky. There was a threat of rain, but 2,000 people greeted them at the station, 3,000 lined the roads, another 3,000 were outside the Congress Hotel when he arrived. 2 months earlier, Illinois had been the scene of Roosevelt's first primary victory, a shocking event that stunned the nation. The first primary ever to have an effect on an election. Now he was back. Along the route, the bands played Roosevelt's Rough Rider campaign theme. There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight. At the Congress Hotel, Roosevelt happily forced his way through the crowd and onto the balcony upstairs, where he waved his black fedora, said, "Chicago's a mighty poor place to steal anything," he shouts at the troops. Down on the ground on Michigan Avenue, the throng included scores of men and women from California who yelled their support. Roosevelt had carried California by 76,000 votes. And people felt that he was entitled to all of the delegates for its winner-take-all primary. But since Taft had won one of the congressional districts, the Taft-controlled Credentials Committee had awarded 2 of the seats to the president, to the incumbent president. The California delegates were outraged. They carried a huge banner that said, "Roosevelt by 76,000, let the people rule." "Those 26 votes are mine," Roosevelt shouted down. "They're mine and they shall be counted for me." The crowd roared its approval. But while most of the crowd's attention, or the public's attention, was focused on the Credentials Committee challenges, including the challenge to the 2 delegates from California, Roosevelt's campaign team knew that they were going to fail. Taft controlled the National Committee, the Credentials Committee. One way or another, he was going to make sure that Roosevelt didn't get those 50 delegates. But Roosevelt had another hope victory, one that's seldom discussed in history books. There were more than 60 black delegates from the Deep South at the convention, the only black delegates at the convention. And all of them had been picked by the Taft, or almost all of them, by the Taft campaign. Roosevelt's managers hoped that the black delegates could be convinced, or perhaps financially induced, to change sides. That weekend, the New York Times told its readers that, quote, "The hopes of the Roosevelt managers for controlling the convention today rest today more strongly than anything else on their hopes of winning over enough of the Taft Negro delegates from the South to make up the deficit that still separates them from a majority." On Saturday night, just hours after Roosevelt had arrived, just hours after he'd waved his black fedora down at the ground at his troops out on Michigan Avenue, more than 1,200 African Americans gathered at Chicago's Peking Theater, known probably to some of the people in the room here, which at the time was the largest black-owned entertainment venue in the country. And it was known for launching the career of ragtime performers like Scott Joplin. As the crowd in the theater roared its approval, Roosevelt supporters begged black delegates to break their pledge to vote for Taft. The Reverend Reverdy Ransom, the fiery pastor of the Bethel's First AME Church in New York City, led the meeting, igniting the crowd by insisting that Taft had been untrue to his oath of office and a traitor to the race. One speaker said the failure to elect Roosevelt would mean putting the Negro in the South back by 40 years. As the celebratory evening ended, the audience joined the great ragtime singer Joe Jordan in singing a rollicking new campaign song called "He's Coming Back." The crowd joined in the refrain. "He's coming back," they sang. "Yes, he's coming back to the White House from Oyster Bay." For the next 4 days, as men fought on the floor over credentials challenges, Roosevelt's forces continued to work on the black delegates. Each side accused the other of attempted bribery. But in the end, TR supporters could only convince 8 of the men to change sides, leave Taft, and support him. It was not nearly enough for him to get the nomination. So after losing almost all the delegate challenges, with only 8 of the black delegates in his corner, Roosevelt told the world that the convention had been stolen. And so when the convention ended, he and his supporters walked out of the convention hall across the street to Orchestra Hall, where Roosevelt announced that he planned to form a new party that would meet again in Chicago 6 weeks later. He famously proclaimed that we stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord. The 8 black delegates who had courageously broken with their own home states deserted Taft to stand with Roosevelt at Orchestra Hall, prepared to go back to their home states, to join him, to be part of that group that would battle for the Lord back in their deep South states. They returned home expecting to be a part of the new party. But to their amazement, they were told they wouldn't even be allowed to join it. What follows provides a somewhat different perspective on Roosevelt's professed belief in the right of the people to rule. Claiming to speak for Roosevelt, white Southern leaders announced that the new party would be lily white. No blacks allowed. This is the Bull Moose Party. This is the Progressive Party. The orders came directly from Roosevelt, but at the time, these black men couldn't believe it, or they chose not to act as though they believed it. They were men of exceptional intelligence and pride and grit. They had risked their careers by joining him and leaving the Republican Party that had been the home to them. They felt there must have been a mistake, or they said there must have been a mistake. So a group of black men in Mississippi, including a Harvard-trained doctor, several lawyers, business leaders, and a poet whose work is still collected in anthologies today, held their own convention and selected a biracial delegation. In early August, 2 delegations from Mississippi went to Chicago. One lily white, one biracial. To some of you here, there will be echoes of what happened in 1964. Roosevelt wanted to see, 64 and 68, but the Fannie Lou Hamer Convention, it was at 64. Roosevelt wanted to seat the all-white delegation, but the Credentials Committee was bitterly split. Finally, at 3 o'clock on the morning that the convention was to open, after 2 tied votes, the Credentials Committee voted 17 to 16 with 1 disputed proxy to seat the all-white delegation and exclude the black delegates. Matthew Hale of Boston delivered a powerful dissent. 2 years earlier, he had been a tutor to TR's son, Ted. Here's what he said. "This is a mighty serious thing we men of the North are doing. We of the North, our fathers, our grandfathers, fought for the Negroes. Now, for the first time, we're saying publicly and openly that our fathers and grandfathers were wrong and have been wrong since the Civil War." Some of those who cared about racial justice were partly mollified by the fact that for the first time in the history, a major convention had African Americans from elsewhere in the country. Places, by the way, where blacks could vote, whereas they'd virtually been excluded from voting in the South as a result of a series of draconian laws. But others couldn't forgive Roosevelt. And by the way, there were women at this convention in large numbers for the first time. But others couldn't forgive Roosevelt. They attacked him personally, and they left his new party. Even Reverend Reverdy Ransom, the black minister who had served as Roosevelt's cheerleader at that Saturday night meeting at the Peking Theater, and actually I won another night, turned against him. Shortly after the Progressive Convention, Reverend Ransom said this to his convention, to his congregation in New York City. "Here is a new party." This is Reverend Ransom, Roosevelt's former friend, man who believed in him, African-American leader. "Here's a new party which proclaims the right of the people to rule, which proposes to devote itself to the cause of social and political justice. And yet, when it comes time to deal with the Negroes, with the people who suffer most from oppression, the people whose men, women, and children are the most defenseless victims and greatest sufferers from social and political injustice, Colonel Roosevelt ran amok." And then he says to the audience, "There are some here in the audience who have been slaves," and there were in his audience people who have been born slaves. "And you know that while there was slavery in the South, the Negroes in the North were not free." There were shouts of, "That's right, that's right." "Well," he said, "if you lose your political rights in the South, you lose them in the North as well." Why did he do it? Why did Roosevelt decide to make his new party lily white in the Deep South? That's a question I've struggled with for the last several years. In part, he hoped to win some southern states in which, after all, blacks could no longer vote as a result of those Jim Crow laws. He may have hoped to heal the deep divisions created by the Civil War. His mother had been a Southern belle. 2 of his uncles had been Civil War champions on the Southern side. "If I could carry one of the 11 ex-Confederate states," he told a white Southern leader that summer, "I feel as though I could die happy." But his effort totally failed. It'd be nice to think that Roosevelt maybe also hoped to help Southern blacks if he was to return to power. Maybe, but I haven't found any proof of that, although that may be part of his motivation. And he also felt that he would get credit with black voters for the fact that for the first time there were black delegates from other states all around the country at his convention. In any case, his decision to exclude Southern blacks represents a stain on his reputation. I started my research, I expected to be able to tell the story of a great American hero. Instead, the book includes a disgraceful story of political self-interest and racism. And looking at today's primary campaigns, it inevitably raises the question, is there anything a candidate wouldn't do in order to win the presidency? But my book also stresses the remarkable accomplishments of the men and the heirs to these 8 men who I profile, these black men who we excluded. Their offspring include Irving Mollison, the first federal African-American judge in the continental United States, son of one of these 8 men. Ruth Attaway, the famous actress who created the role of Reba in You Can't Take It With You, an actress many of you have seen. Her brother, these were both the sons of William Attaway, one of the excluded men, became a wonderful writer whose songs included the Banana Boat song, which we all know as Day-O, made famous by Harry Belafonte. Those are the children of a second of these excluded men. And one of their offspring, Michael Middleton, the civil rights lawyer who just 6 weeks ago earned international headlines as becoming the president of the University of Missouri, is the great-grandson of a third of these men. Those are the men that TR excluded from the 1912 Bull Moose Convention. But looking at the scope of the year 1912, Roosevelt did change the presidential nominating process. The political primaries that he did so much to create proved that men with apparent liabilities, and one presumes women as well, can appeal to the public. His reforms allowed for the nomination of John F. Kennedy as a Republican Party candidate when he proved in West Virginia particularly that Protestant voters would vote for a Catholic for president. They proved that a man on the eve of his 70th birthday, doesn't seem so old in today's presidential politics, but it did at the time, could be a vigorous campaigner, could become president and serve distinguishedly in office, and made possible the nomination of Ronald Reagan. And just 7 years ago, those primaries made possible the nomination election of the first African-American president of the United States. I said I'd tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book, and then maybe we can talk a little about this primary season and the facts in the book. And I want to do it by giving you some context about the way in which presidents have been picked. You know, the nomination of presidents is not something people really know much about. But there have been 4 stages in American history the way presidents were picked. At the beginning of the Republic, they were picked by something you read about in your history or civics books called King Caucus. The caucus is the political party. If that were the system, the Republican members of Congress would pick the Republican nominee, Barbara and the Democratic members of Congress would pick the Democratic nominee. That would be the system. That changed in 1832. When, in a reform largely ascribed to Andrew Jackson, I mean, it started with the Masons, but Andrew Jackson was the one who popularized and first made a major party, the Democratic Convention, and then the Republican Convention too. Party created conventions. So now governors and mayors and big party leaders and contributors and so forth could all become part of those conventions. That convention system was the system from 1832 until 1912. In 1912, we saw the reforms that I just told you about. And so from 1912 until 1968, we had a mixed system. But it was a system in which the convention could still overturn the popular will of the people as expressed in primaries. You saw that here. Some of you will remember that Estes Kefauver won almost all the primaries in 1952. Adlai Stevenson, who hadn't run any primaries, won the nomination that was given the nomination that year. And in 1968, and this is really what changed things, Hubert Humphrey, after that contentious year in which McCarthy and Kennedy had won primaries, Hubert Humphrey, who not won a single primary, became the nominee of the Democratic Party. After that, reforms were instituted, which led to a system in which almost all the delegates are picked through that popular system, the process we live in today. So you know how the reforms of 1832 happened, you know about 1912. Let's see a short tape that tells us what happened in 1968. This is Howard K. Smith on the opening night of the 1972 Democratic Convention.
The Democratic Convention meets tonight in the long shadow of Geoffrey Cowan. You don't know who Geoffrey Cowan is. Well, I'll tell you who Geoffrey Cowan is. He was 4 summers ago a Yale student to whom the novel question occurred, how are all the delegates to the coming Chicago Convention of that year chosen? He researched every state, and he found that 10 states had no rules whatever for choosing delegates. In those states and in some others, delegates were picked by a handful of men in a room, or by governors, or by local bosses. A total of 600 delegates, nearly half enough to nominate a president, were picked with no reference whatever to the public. Cowan printed those results in a pamphlet called The Democratic Choice, and he sent 7,000 copies of the pamphlet to Democrats everywhere. When the Chicago Convention opened, the pamphlet led the convention to vote, rather casually, to reform rules for choosing delegates. To most of the politicians, the vote was a do-good gesture to be forgotten, but not to George McGovern. He led a commission to write new democratic rules. In long, intense, quiet negotiations with each state, the press didn't cover them, the old-line Democrats hardly noticed they were happening. McGovern got each state in turn to agree to the new rules. The battles to take place here tonight are all about who fits the new rules and who fails to, and the new Puritans are almost bound to win. Over the hall tonight, you'll see hanging huge pictures of the men who made the Democratic Party what it is. But one is oddly missing, that of young Geoffrey Cowan, the man who did more to change Democratic conventions than anybody since Andrew Jackson first started. Harry?
Thank you. A little improbable, a little bit of an overstatement, but nevertheless, I did have some role that year. And my inspiration that year was Theodore Roosevelt and what he had done in 1912. And so this is a story I always wanted to find. He was my hero then. But I'd also been in the civil rights movement in Mississippi in 1964. And so I have this clash of feelings. And my book is dedicated, besides being dedicated to my wife, Eileen, who's here, and her children, it's dedicated to the people who fought to expand the franchise in 1912 and those who were trying to expand the franchise today. And one perceptive reporter asked me, do I include Roosevelt among those who tried to expand the franchise in 1912? And I feel like a scene from Chinatown, where I say, yes, he did, but he didn't, but he did. Do we have time for a couple of questions? Are there mics I think not. Are there mics, right?
Geoffrey, with all of your populist work, is there a part of you that thinks the old boss?
Is there a part of me that would like to go back to the old bosses? Well, if it was the people in this room, yes. But I think that I've tried to think about that a lot, and I think how I feel about it is sort of the way that Churchill felt about democracy, where he said it was the worst form of government except for all the others. Well, I don't think that was just a joke. I think it's a bad form of government, but I think the others are worse. And if you just had the old system in play, what would that world be like? And how would the campaign finance rules work for that? And who would be making the decisions, and who would they be beholden to? Barbara Boxer. And we have how much time for questions? Do I have a monitor? No. 3 minutes, okay. Barbara?
That was so wonderful. You just loved it and brought us back. It's so interesting. TR is so interesting. And I just wondered, you didn't touch on what were the overriding issues other than this
Yeah.
right to vote? What was going on, and why did they turn against CAP when they went to TR?
Yeah. I think it partly, and actually, Barbara, this is an issue.
Repeat the question?
Okay, I'll repeat the question. What were the substantive reasons that people turned against Taft? And what did Roosevelt make his campaign themes? And part of it was the popular democracy thing, which was a progressive theme of the era and so forth. But a big part of it was personal. And I think Taft, and this is relevant today, Taft, who I think, by the way, as a person, I admired him enormously. Taft was a judge and later became Chief Justice of the United States. That was his temperament. Roosevelt was a warrior. Taft believed that things should be done in a judicious way. It wasn't that he wanted a different outcome necessarily. So he would not issue executive orders, for example, that would protect conservation in the same way that Roosevelt would. And so Roosevelt's supporters thought that he had turned his back, particularly on Gifford Pinchot and other people who were fighting for greater conservation. So that was part of it, was that temperamental thing, and it has its echoes today with how far the president should go with executive orders. But also, interestingly, and if you read the book, you'll see this amazing story. There were other reasons, that other big fights they had, and one of them, which will surprise a lot of people here, is Roosevelt. I always grew up thinking of Roosevelt as a trust buster. And you wouldn't have thought of Taft as a trust buster. The truth was that Roosevelt had turned against trust busting. Now, he believed in government regulation of corporations, which goes to government power but he didn't believe in trust busting. So that became a huge issue between them, particularly when Roosevelt had allowed, I'll tell this one last story. Roosevelt had allowed the merger of U.S. Steel with one of its competitors. And Roosevelt's Justice Department had not brought any trust action against that merger. So 4 years later, Taft's Justice Department brought an antitrust case against U.S. Steel, and basically said that Roosevelt had been misled. This led the supporters of the key people in U.S. Steel all became big supporters of Roosevelt, even though he was running in many ways, it seems like a populist or progressive campaign. He had two big financial supporters and others who were helping him, and they basically were U.S. Steel people. And he made one of his campaign themes the importance of regulating corporations instead of breaking up trusts. So it's a series of very complicated things at the time, some of which, when you read them, are kind of astonishing in terms of the way we imagine Theodore Roosevelt. Thank you all for coming, and maybe see you later.